What actually happens to 28 men when they're frozen into the same square mile of ice for almost 2 years? Most people assume there are only two endings. You die of the cold, or you become a legend. Here's the part nobody puts in the textbook. The ice didn't break the men first. Their minds went first. We all know the poster version of this story. Ernest Shackleton, the leader who brought every single one of his men home alive. Feels like a clean, perfect ending, right? But the actual diaries these men kept, Thomas Ord-Lees, Frank Wild, Harry McNish, read nothing like the poster. They describe factions, silent hatred over the sound of someone chewing, and a leader who wasn't managing the cold. He was managing 27 other minds slowly coming apart, with his own included. So let's go back to the ice. Not the postcard version, the one written in real time by the men actually living it. December 1914. A ship called Endurance is pushing south into the Weddell Sea, aiming for a coastline no one has ever crossed. Getting onto that ship wasn't easy. Shackleton needed about 90 men. He reportedly got thousands of applicants. The exact wording of his recruitment ad gets repeated everywhere. Hazardous journey, bitter cold, safe return, doubtful. But historians can't actually confirm it ran in that exact form. Might be real, might be legend polishing itself. Either way, the response was real. Over 5,000 men wanted in. 28 made the final cut for the ship. 27 crew, plus one stowaway who talked his way aboard and got promoted to steward instead of thrown off. Shackleton's line to that stowaway, William Bakewell, or so the story goes, was that stowaways get eaten first if supplies run out. He meant it as a joke, sort of. Here's the thing about picking a polar crew. You're not hiring for skill first. You're hiring for who can sit in a small space with the same faces for years without wanting to kill them. Shackleton knew this. He packed a banjo. He packed board games. He packed more books than tools in some cases. He was already planning for the boredom war before the ice war even started. January 1915. The Endurance is a few days from land. Then, a gale slams the pack ice shut behind them. Ord-Lees described it later, and this line survived. The ship was frozen in like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. No way forward, no way back. Just ice in every direction for as far as anyone could see. This is where the real story starts. Not the sinking, the waiting. 10 months. That's how long Endurance sat locked in ice before it was finally crushed. 10 months of nothing happening, which turns out to be far worse for the human brain than something happening. The days blurred into the same routine. Watch the ice, feed the dogs, write in a diary nobody thought anyone outside the ship would ever read. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, kept shooting anyway. Some of the most haunting images of this entire expedition come from a man calmly documenting his own crew's slow unraveling. October 1915. The ice finally does what everyone feared. It starts crushing the hull. The crew worked pumps in 15-minute shifts for 28 straight hours trying to save her. It didn't matter. The sea got in anyway. Shackleton gave the order most people know. Abandon ship. Set up camp on the ice itself. What people don't know is what that order actually meant psychologically. You're not just losing a boat. You're losing the last solid man-made thing between you and Antarctica. They called it Ocean Camp. Then later, Patience Camp. The second name tells you everything about how that period actually felt. Picture this. You're on a floating slab of ice that could split open under your tent at any second. Same 27 faces every single day. Nowhere to walk to. Nothing to fix. Nothing to hunt most days. Antarctic silence isn't peaceful. Multiple crew accounts describe it as the opposite. A pressure that makes you listen to your own thoughts whether you want to or not. Thomas Ord-Lees ran the stores. He was, by his own crewmates' account, one of the least popular men on the ship, but his diary turned out to be one of the sharpest, most detailed records anyone kept. Sometimes the person nobody likes is the one paying closest attention. His entries describe the small stuff curdling into real resentment. The way a man ate, the sound of someone's breathing 3 feet away in a canvas tent. Things that mean nothing in normal life started to feel unbearable. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, later wrote a line about the crew that historians still quote directly. At least half the party were, in his words, insane. Not a metaphor from a screenwriter, a line from the actual second-in-command of the expedition, writing about his own men. Shackleton's genius, and it really was genius, wasn't staying warm. It was staying one psychological trick ahead of a full breakdown. He staged talent shows on pack ice. He organized football matches next to a dying ship. He made men sing after days that gave them nothing to sing about. From the outside, that looks like morale. From the inside, more than one diary describes it as something closer to controlled desperation, noise loud enough to drown out the silence. Here's what makes this whole period more than just an old adventure story. Modern science actually has a name for what these men were going through. Researchers call it winter over syndrome. It shows up today in people who spend long stretches at Antarctic research stations, real scientists in heated buildings with satellite phones. Lawrence Palinkas, who has spent decades studying Antarctic psychology, documented irritability, depression, sleep disruption, and slipping memory as a near universal pattern among people isolated through the polar night. A 2018 study out of Concordia Station, led by psychologist Nathan Smith at the University of Manchester, tracked crews through an entire dark season and found something researchers now call psychological hibernation, mood and sleep patterns shifting in ways that look almost biological, not just emotional. There's even a physical piece to it. Some researchers link the symptoms to what's nicknamed polar T3 syndrome, changes in thyroid hormone tied to extreme cold and darkness, possibly affecting mood and thinking directly. Now here's the part that should give you chills. Endurance's crew had none of the comforts modern station staff get. No heating, no email home, no relief crew arriving next season. Alfred Lansing, whose 1959 book on this expedition is still considered one of the most carefully researched accounts of what happened, quoted a crew member's own description of the polar night. No warmth, no life, no movement, and it had, in his exact words, driven some men mad. So when Frank Wild said half the party had lost their minds, he wasn't exaggerating for effect. He was describing, in real time, a documented condition science wouldn't formally name for another 60 years. And then came the part almost nobody talks about: the animals. The expedition had close to 70 sled dogs at points, plus a ship's cat named Mrs. Chippy, who, despite the name, was male and belonged to the carpenter Harry McNish. To the crew, these animals weren't just cargo. They were the last living things on that ice that weren't quietly falling apart in the same way the men were. But food was running out, and weight on the boats meant survival for the men. Shackleton made the call. The dogs were shot. So was Mrs. Chippy. Shackleton himself wrote that it was the worst job that we had had throughout the expedition. That's not a small admission from a man who otherwise didn't write much about his own guilt. Harry McNish, the man who owned the cat, never fully forgave him. Their relationship stayed cold for the rest of the expedition, and McNish is on record later openly challenging Shackleton's authority once the ship itself was gone. Think about what that decision actually costs a man. you're not just losing supplies, you're being ordered to end the one relationship on that ice that still felt like home. April 1916. The ice beneath Patience Camp finally splits. Time to move into 3 small lifeboats into open ocean toward the nearest speck of land. That speck was Elephant Island, uninhabited, barely habitable, but solid ground for the first time in almost 16 months. Getting there took 5 brutal days at sea in overloaded boats in temperatures that dropped as low as -20 Fahrenheit. 28 men reached land, every single one of them still alive. That number is the part the myth gets right. But Elephant Island wasn't rescue. It was just a slightly less lethal version of being trapped. Shackleton knew no ship would ever find 28 men on that rock by accident. Someone had to go get help. Across 800 miles of the worst ocean on the planet, in a modified lifeboat barely over 20 feet long, he picked 5 men, including Captain Frank Worsley and Harry McNish, the same man who never forgave him for the cat. 16 days at sea, Worsley reportedly went nearly 80 hours without real sleep, navigating by sextant readings he could barely see through the spray. They landed on the wrong side of South Georgia Island. The whaling station with actual humans on it was on the other side, across mountains no one had ever crossed on foot. 3 of them, including Shackleton and Worsley, hiked 36 straight hours over that terrain. No map worth trusting, no proper climbing gear, just movement, because stopping meant freezing. When they finally reached the whaling station, the men there reportedly didn't recognize Shackleton. Not surprising. Nobody expects the person standing in front of them to have just walked out of that story. Meanwhile, back on Elephant Island, 22 men were living under 2 overturned lifeboats, eating whatever they could hunt, repeating the same ritual every morning. Pack your things, in case today's the day the boss comes back. Some accounts describe them getting close enough to food scarcity that grim jokes started forming about who would be eaten first if it came to that. Whether meant seriously or as dark camp humor, the fact that the joke existed says enough on its own. 3 rescue attempts failed, turned back by ice. On the 4th, in a borrowed Chilean ship called the Yelcho, Shackleton finally made it through. August 30th, 1916, the men on Elephant Island spotted a ship. Within about an hour, camp was broken and every one of them was aboard. 28 men left England for this expedition. 28 men came home. In terms of pure survival, this really is one of the great outcomes in exploration history. But survival and recovery aren't the same thing. Multiple crew members struggled for years afterward. Cold that wasn't really there anymore. Silences that followed them home from a place with no sound at all. Part of why the clean version won out is simple. Shackleton controlled the story afterward. He wrote his own account called South, published in 1919. He went on a lecture tour with it. Frank Hurley's surviving photographs and film reels became the images the public actually saw. None of that is a criticism, exactly. Shackleton needed money, needed his reputation intact, and had every reason to frame the expedition as triumph rather than near collapse. Diaries meant for no one but the writer don't get that same edit. For over a century, the polished version was basically the only version most people had access to. The rawer diaries stayed in libraries and private collections, read mostly by historians. The photograph everyone knows, smiling men, safely rescued, cheering on deck, became the version of this story that got repeated for over a century. What got quietly left out was the version written in real time. The factions, the resentment over nothing. The second in command calling half his own crew insane and meaning it. Shackleton wasn't lying when he brought his men home. That part is completely true, and it's still remarkable. But the full story was never really about the cold, or the ice, or even the ship. It was about what 28 human minds do to each other when there's nowhere left to go. In March 2022, a search team called the Endurance 22 Expedition, working with the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, found the actual ship. Nearly 10,000 feet down in the Weddell Sea, still remarkably preserved in the cold and the dark, 106 years after it sank. They found her name in brass letters on the stern. No one had touched that ship since the ice closed over it in November 1915. There's something fitting about that. The wreck spent over a century sitting in the exact kind of silence and darkness that broke the minds of the men who once stood on its deck. We don't fully know how each of these men made peace with what they went through. Some diaries just stop mid-sentence and never pick the story back up. So next time you see that famous rescue photo, look at the eyes a little longer. The ice let their bodies go home. It's not clear it ever fully let go of the rest. Thanks for watching. See you next time.